Okay, so just a little introduction to how we're going to present this this talk. Nina and I will talk about the data that we've gathered in the case study museums so far. We're just talking about 3 of those museums, and we'll be sort of alternating. We've tried to integrate our presentation, so we're sharing the floor. We're also using data that came from 2 other researchers on the project, Garcia at Schindler's Factory, and Mariana, who collected data at Coleridge Museum. Unfortunately, she's not with us today. Okay, so I'll begin. Museums dealing with the heritage of conflict are important shapers and communicators of cultural memory. And profiting from both the museum boom and the memory boom, they enjoy unprecedented popularity. A key focus of the UNREST project is therefore an analysis of the memory messages transmitted by war museums. But the communication of these messages is a process that extends beyond transmission to include reception and interpretation by the audience. Recognising that the museum is an open work completed by its visitors, the UNREST project is also conducting visitor research, which is a process that of course throws up its own sets of challenges. So let me introduce the outline of our talk today. I'll begin with a brief introduction to our methodology, including our research tools and the kind of progress that we've made so far. I'll also introduce some of the limitations and challenges that we encountered and that kind of come up from the literature and also borne out in our experience. And then, as I said, I'll get onto the kind of meat of presenting some of the initial data. This is very much an impressionistic look at the data. We haven't done a thorough analysis yet. There's no kind of systematic analysis, but we'll present some of the kind of general perceptions and themes that are emerging, and then some tentative conclusions at the end. Can everybody hear me okay, by the way? Okay. Okay, so in terms of methodology, our primary research tool is a qualitative, semi-structured interview. It takes the form of a questionnaire with just over 20 questions in total. And we're using the questionnaire at the end, it's a post-visit questionnaire that we're asking 30 visitors to each museum at the end of their visit. We've tried to target a minimum of 10 visitors from each kind of the big sort of national categories represented at the museum. So for example, at the Karlshorst Museum, that would be Russians and Germans. The Historial, we tried to get French, British and Germans, but I'll talk more about that when we get to the data collection, but that's the principle we were working on. The next tool is an analysis, or the next kind of research method, is an analysis of the visitor books. This is more a supplementary method, but we decided to examine books from the early years of each museum to look at responses to, the early responses to the establishment of the museum, significant years at the museum at sort of regular intervals. And Nina will be presenting about Coleridge in terms of visitor books. There is a third research tool that we've tried, we're beginning to use in a second museum. We've already used it at Coleridge, we're now using it at the Historial. And this is an electronic device, a tablet with a kind of app-based questionnaire, which is much shorter and can give us a bit more quantitative data. But this is, again, supplementary. We're not going to be using it at all 5 museums, and we're actually trying to pilot it to use in Essen, which you'll hear more about later on. Okay. So in terms of our progress then, let me take you through it. At the beginning, we started last year, about September last year probably, or maybe in the summer, with bibliographic work and a report on museum visitor studies. I've highlighted a URL there where you can see a very, very short, shortened version in a blog, so it's not particularly academic, but there's no bibliography. But you can see a very short summary of some of those findings. And also wanted to advertise that UNREST does have a blog, so please check it out. We also did some informal consulting with a range of visitor experts, visitor studies experts, some of whom are here today, so thank you for being with us. And a highlight for me personally was a one-day visitor studies workshop that we did in Berlin at the National Historical Museum. I think Lucy is here somewhere. Hi, yes, so thanks Lucy. Lucy led that. And we tried lots of things in this workshop. It was, like I said, it was a full day. We practiced things like formulating questions, sampling, or we talked about sampling, coding visitor responses. We had some hands-on practice and coaching with how to interview, how to kind of engage visitors with the questionnaire. And of course we had an opportunity to pilot a little bit the questionnaire. And so afterwards we could discuss as a group, all of the WP4 researchers could discuss how it went and discuss some possible improvements to the questionnaire. The questionnaire was then revised and piloted again in January at Schindler's Factory. So finally we implemented it. We've completed the questionnaire research at least 3 museums now. I think it's still ongoing, 2 of them at Karlshorst and Dresden, but I may be out of date with that information. Okay. As I said at the beginning, the analysis of all of this data is very much ongoing, or we're at the beginning of the stage of analysis in terms of a comparative analysis. It's not so difficult to analyse the data of one museum individually, but then to make sure we can have a comparative analysis, we need to come together again, I think, and discuss that a little bit more. Okay, as I said, I was going to introduce some limitations and challenges. So this is just a very brief run through of some of the key challenges that we faced that come up from the literature on visitor studies. So first of all, we're taking a qualitative approach, but that raises questions about what can be really measured with a qualitative approach. What can we record? Sampling is a big issue. Museums themselves often don't know in very clear terms who their visitors are. So how can we, and of course we have limited resources and limited time, so how can we sample the museum's audience successfully? How can we ensure that our findings are comparable across 5 different museums in different contexts with different researchers? To what extent are visitors themselves reliable witnesses or narrators of their own experience? And how can we combine multiple methods to develop a richer understanding? Most of the literature advises the use of more than one method. To what extent do visitors seek out experiences that chime with rather than challenge their own beliefs? I think this is an issue for all museums, but particularly when a museum is intending to confront difficult history or unsettled memories, it becomes even more relevant. And finally, time. As I said, we had limited resources, but recent visitor research does emphasise the importance of longitudinal studies. So this is a limitation. Okay, so I'll move on to the findings. As I say, these are very impressionistic. Beginning with the Historial, Nina and I were there. Yeah, please, we'll share this section. Nina and I were at the Historial earlier this month, so this is very fresh data from the Historial. And we collected 30 interviews. In fact, we did 32, was it? And this is the national sort of breakdown. We did manage to hit our target in terms of French and British visitors, but we had to just create an other category rather than German. We had 1 German respondent, 2 that we just couldn't find any more, unfortunately. 2 Belgians, I have these, yes, 2 Belgians, 2 Belgians, 1 Israeli, 1 New Zealander, 1 American, 2 Australians. Okay, so it's quite mixed in terms of the other. We tried to get a reasonable breakdown in terms of gender, but you can see it's not ideal, but this is part of the limitation, one of the limitations. Very few people turned down the opportunity to talk to us. People were happy to be interviewed. Our age range was fairly narrow. I'd say the average was probably around 60 or just over 60. So this is just who visits the Historial in early September. Okay, I'll hand over to Nina for a moment.
So Schindler's Factory. I didn't do the interviews at Schindler's Factory. Gorsha did them, and she completed them in June. She did 36 interviews, only 4 with polls, and I think there's a return visit plan to interview more polls. I think the visitors, it doesn't surprise me, were very enthusiastic about talking to Gorsha about their experiences of visiting the museum. She's very enthusiastic about doing the interviews too. And I think some even approached her directly. That happened a couple of times at the Historia, that people came to us to talk to us when they saw what we were doing. At Schindler's Factory, many Australians and Americans were interviewed, but also Israelis, Russians, English, French, Spanish, Germans and Koreans. The age groups at Schindler's Factory are much wider than at the Historiale. So the age groups that were covered were 15 to 25, 25 to 40, 40 to 60, 60 plus. I think the youngest one at the Historiale was 27, just to give you some idea of these different age groups. Again, Gorsha tried to interview a similar number of men and women.
Okay. So what we'll do next is show you the questions in the questionnaire and briefly summarise what kind of responses we got at the two museums, alternating. So the first section of the questionnaire is quite generally about the visit. The visitors found these very easy to answer, so it's a nice kind of soft opening. The first question, is this the first time you're visiting? At the Historiale, only one person was a repeat visitor. Everybody else, it was their first time. When asked why they decided to visit, most said that they were visiting as part of a tour of the local area, often passing through the Somme on the way to or from a holiday destination, taking in a range of World War I sites and museums. A significant number of all nationalities said that the purpose of their trip was associated with a relative who had fought in the war. Some were visiting as part of a small group with a shared interest in battlefield tourism. Yeah, I'll stop there. Sorry.
For Schindler's Factory, most people decided to visit the museum for two reasons. Spielberg's film, Schindler's List, or a general interest in history. It's quite interesting, well, Gorsha's analysis of these results is interesting. Many respondents had not even seen the film, they'd only heard about it, but they still decided to come because of the film. They were hoping to learn something more about the film's production and about the story that the film told. In terms of the interest in history, again, another interesting response, because their interest in history, or their knowledge of history, didn't necessarily align with any knowledge about the Polish situation in the Second World War. Historical knowledge was generally limited to German-occupied Europe, and people didn't know a lot about Poland. So, in the responses as we go through them, what we'll see is that most visitors came because of Spielberg's film, but the film itself does not appear later in the responses. So yeah, we'll come back to that.
So moving on to general context. Most visitors, now this is a bit of a subjective comment of course, but it seemed that visitors tended to be fairly modest or conservative in their estimation of their prior knowledge. Although two battlefield tourism enthusiasts did say that their knowledge was very good. So they clearly, had very intrinsic motivation for being there. And in terms of what other similar places or exhibitions they'd seen in recent years, these are some of the examples that I heard. Many of them other sites in the Somme area or the Western Front more generally, including Ypres and Verdun, or northern France relating to the Second World War, like Normandy beaches or Caen. But of course there were some international museums coming up as well, like the Imperial War Museums and battlefield sites associated with the American Civil War. Yeah, I'll hand it.
So for Schindler's Factory, most visitors mentioned Auschwitz and or the Jewish Museum in Berlin or Warsaw when they were talking about other similar places that they'd visited, the context in which they were visiting this museum. And most of the visitors spontaneously connected the museum to the subject of the Holocaust. And this is interesting because the creators of the museum wanted to create an exhibition about occupied Krakow. Visitors see it as a story of Jews in Krakow during the Second World War and during the Holocaust.
Okay, now general perceptions. We started by asking about expectations, and many visitors at the Historia claimed that they came without expectations. Although some said that they expected that the museum would provide a more general overview of the whole war than would be offered at other local museums. A very small number of respondents referred to the multinational approach, the transnational approach. Not many people mentioned that. Those that arrived with expectations generally said that their expectations were met. Okay, but of course those that didn't have expectations couldn't really comment. Although there were some visitors who said that they were surprised by how modern, they said modern and light and airy, the museum appeared in comparison with other war museums. I think locally and more generally. Let's see. Okay, moving on to what they remembered. The Dix prints, the Otto Dix room, was commonly cited here, with visitors noting how powerful the images are. Some visitors also noticed, or noted, of course, the horizontal presentation of the soldiers, describing it as poignant. And some also commented on what they described as the little videos. There are small screens throughout the museum showing contemporary footage from the 1914 to 1918. And these were things that the visitors remembered. When asked if they learned anything new, some visitors answered negatively, but most had a general sense of having gained a better understanding of the period. Some could point to specific items that they learned. Some liked the introduction to the July crisis in 1914 in the first room. And a few visitors said explicitly that they thought the visit had reinforced their prior knowledge. When asked what they liked or disliked, many visitors said that they disliked nothing. Not all of them, I'll tell you what they disliked. But all visitors liked something. Most of the likes corresponded with the things that they remembered. In terms of dislikes, they were usually not about the content of the museum, but rather about the kind of small inconveniences, like there wasn't enough room to sit down or places to sit down. There weren't any English subtitles on the main film, things like that. One French visitor did say that she found the museum cold in its atmosphere, which was quite interesting because we read this as a critical opinion, but it was our first time to encounter it. But in terms of our small sample, it wasn't a majority opinion.
Right, I'm not going to spend too much time on the general perception of Schindler's Factory. The answers generally concerned issues related to the history of the Second World War. I want to move on to multi-perspectivity because this is where it gets a bit more interesting here. Now, Gosha allowed the visitors to develop their own interpretations of multi-perspectivity. This was quite a challenging question. And so she was asking them how many perspectives can be shown in one exhibition, what are the limits of the possibilities for the creators of the exhibition. And quite simply, the visitors most often understood the concept of multi-perspectivity in this museum as showing two groups, victims and perpetrators. And we'll see that the next questions gave them the opportunity to develop what they meant by this. What they pointed out was a lack of or an absence of gender perspective. And they indicated that the exhibition mainly shows men who have the power, a male view of war. So answers were quite limited when it came to multi-perspectivity. If they saw it at all, it was just perpetrators and victims. And here Gosha has done some interesting work with analysis of language used to describe these categories. Perpetrators were shown as only perpetrators, with no characteristics other than hatred, evil, cruelty, so abstract nouns being used to describe them. Their characters were also dehumanised. Visitors used abstract expressions such as war or history to name the motivations of perpetrators. In the case of victims, the visitors described them with the words sacrifice, dedication, poor people. So that starts to give us some idea about how people are perceiving and different perspectives of the museum.
Okay, in terms of the historial and questions about multi-perspectivity, most visitors answered positively to the first question. They could identify a range of perspectives, usually along national lines. They noticed the French, British and German perspectives. Less frequently, they noted different perspectives coming from political or popular sides, or civilian and military perspectives. Some visitors also referred to the representation of colonial troops, which doesn't appear in all of the museums in the area. A number of British respondents commented positively that it was unusual to see the German perspective well represented. Visitors most often understood the concept as showing... Oh, sorry, that's Nisha's part, you've heard that already. Yeah, so to the next question... Missing perspectives. Some people mentioned gender here as well. There is women and children are represented in the Historial, but some visitors wanted to see more. And moving on to the final question, I think everybody answered that they did want to see, or maybe except again for one French visitor, answered that they did want to see multiple perspectives in the interest of balance and not perceiving bias.
Great.
Okay.
On to the next set of questions about victims, perpetrators and heroes. I feel like I'm doing the interviews again now. So at Schindler's Factory, the visitors noticed this difference easily, although they called them different things. A similar number of responses named Poles and Jews as victims. Most of the visitors described the Germans as perpetrators and additionally as criminals. So for victims, Jews and Poles. For perpetrators, Germans, Hitler, the SS, German officials, and history with a capital H. And this last answer is interesting because it came from a soldier from Leipzig. Gosh only interviewed him, but he was with a group of soldiers. So yeah, and there was in this group there was someone associated with a military history museum. This is where it starts getting confused already. So yeah.
Okay. At the Historial, a significant number of respondents said that everybody was a victim, reflecting the kind of universalising victimhood trope that's come up in an earlier discussion of the Historial. However, there were a small number of visitors who couldn't identify any victims in the museum and said that the museum doesn't emphasise victimhood, which was an interesting result that we weren't expecting. Some participants identified victims along national lines, putting the Allies in the category of victim. Others identified them along across social groups, identifying all the soldiers in the trenches or all the civilians as victims. In terms of responsibility, some visitors struggled to identify any responsibility or perpetration, stating that this was not emphasised by the museum, whereas others identified politicians, diplomats and/or generals on all sides. Some British participants indicated a more explicitly class-based analysis, stating that the aristocracy or the higher-ups were responsible.
For the second question here, we asked different questions for Second World War museums and for First World War museums. So for the second, for Schindler's Factory, the question was about perpetrators. Who are the perpetrators? What were their motivations? And how is this escalation of violence possible? So did they have an idea about the perpetrators? Yes, overwhelmingly, Germans. Their motivations, this is where it gets interesting. Only the youngest age group, so that's the 15 to 25, answered yes. The motivations were power, the motivations were money. Most visitors were unable to identify what were the motivations of the perpetrators. And what Gosh has brought out is that it's the youngest age group who are trying to find an answer to that. The other age groups didn't really try. In terms of escalation of violence, many respondents focused on the logic of war and compared it to today's wars in the Middle East. And that's another similarity with Historia, where we got visitors commenting on the links to contemporary warfare.
We asked the second question at the Historial about the attitudes of soldiers and civilians, and again this was a difficult question for many visitors to answer, but the answers were quite mixed. Several answered negatively, saying that there was propaganda in the museum which represented what civilians were supposed to think, but didn't give you a full idea of what they actually thought. Several visitors did say positively that they could see the attitudes of soldiers and civilians. Examples they gave came from across the exhibition, including the Diggs exhibition, which gives a psychological perspective, one person said, or the trench artifacts. One visitor said that this gave you an insight into the soldiers' boredom in the trenches. Some visitors also noticed that they could see a change in attitude from the beginning of the war, when there was more enthusiasm, to the later stages of the war, when there was fatigue.
In terms of are victims portrayed as passive objects of perpetration or as actors in their own right, this was a difficult question for visitors. In the Historia, they struggled with this one. But at Schindler's Factory, what people started talking about, or what emerged from their responses, is the way in which, according to visitors, the exhibition shows war. War becomes, in their response, a kind of atmospheric phenomenon that suddenly happens to people. So both perpetrators and victims are subjects to its rules, but they do not create any rules themselves. They only accept the roles imposed by war, so they're entirely passive here. The exhibition begins with the invasion of Poland by Germany, and from that moment the Germans are dehumanised creatures and victims poor people. And the victim's attitude is defined as active only in the context of the underground fight against the occupants. So it builds a romantic vision of the good people who've become victims.
Again, at the Historial, this was one of the most difficult questions to answer, but several respondents said that the victims were passive, referring to soldiers being under pressure to sign up or having no choice about following orders. Civilians were also sometimes referred to as passive or submissive, having been completely caught out with no way to defend themselves. One respondent cited the museum's depiction of women as largely passive, contrasting images of mutilated women in the propaganda about the Germans in the occupied territories, contrasting that with only one lone portrayal of an active woman helping at the battlefront. The same visitor commented that she'd seen nothing about resistance in the museum. Evidence supporting an active view of victims was also varied. One respondent said that the war was a sad time, but everyone had a purpose. Another respondent said that the soldiers were victims, but that they were also killing machines. They were victimised by poor leadership, but also active participants in violence. He cited Dix's depiction of hand-to-hand combat as an example of this.
In terms of heroes, the last question, Schindler's Factory is going to be Schindler, isn't it, the hero? But at this point, Schindler appears very rarely in these answers. The age group 40 to 60 primarily pointed to civilians as heroes, and several answers were about mothers protecting their children as heroines.
At the Historial, most visitors struggled to identify any heroism in the exhibition, stating that heroes were not a priority of the museum. Several visitors could identify heroism in the contemporary objects on display, but they noted that this was evidence of an effort to create heroes during the war, and they said that they didn't think the museum was trying to reproduce this manufacture of heroism in the present day.
So that's the data from Schindler's Factory and the Historial. I've got a section on Coleridge, the visitors' books from Coleridge, which is about 5 minutes. Is that okay?
Okay.
Yeah. I would love to shorten it, but this is Mariana's section, and I would be hard pushed to shorten it. So I'm going to read this section. So, total number of visitors to Coleridge Museum by 2016 had reached 1,500,000, and the average number of visitors per year is around 70,000, as Anna said earlier. At the beginning, Slovenes mainly visited the museum, while in 2014 the number of foreign visitors reached 2/3 of the total. Among them, primarily Italians, to whom the museum is addressed, followed by Austrians, Germans, Hungarians, Americans, Brits, Czechs, Croats, Israelis, and so on. So what did they do? What did Mariana do? So, she analysed visitors' books and interviewed 40 visitors in April, and they decided with Anna to take the comments from some selected years. We've done that for all the museums, because if not, it's overwhelming, the visitors' books. So why these years? 1991 to 1992, the first years of the museum, absolutely key, when the museum received the Council of Europe Museum Prize after the War of Independence. Particularly relevant was also the year 2005, because in 2004, Slovenia became a European and NATO member. All the comments found were written in many languages, and what they've decided to do is to just consider the Italians and Slovenes and translate them into English. For the interviews, Mariana interviewed 40 visitors of different age groups, 10 Slovenes, 15 Italians, and the rest mainly from Europe and the US. So I'm going to talk quickly, about visitors' books. So how do visitors react to the museum? Both in their comments and interviews, visitors seem to grasp the anti-war message conveyed by the museum. Therefore, the most common response of Slovene and Italian, from the Slovene and Italian general public, is to express an anti-war sentiment. and wish for peace. So we've got some examples there on the slide. So among the Italian comments, you can see against all wars in capital letters. Capitals are used quite a lot in this visitor's book from Mariana's accounts. War is a terrible thing, never again. Now, it's interesting, this anti-war message, because the visitor book is placed just below Ernest Hemingway's photos in a small corner dedicated to him. Apart from the photo of the American writer who came to the front as a volunteer, there are some pages taken from his work. So we were thinking about this in relation to the Historia and how the placement of the visitor's book will influence comments in turn. Within the category of people supporting the anti-war message, there are those who still remain sceptical. For instance, among the Italians, you can see on this slide again, why does not man learn from past experiences? Or history repeats itself, why, how? Also in the comments, there is an opposing group of visitors who seem to reject the main message of the museum, and Mariana named this the patriotic or nationalist group. And here you see messages like honour to our fallen soldiers on the Eastern fronts, Caporetto, a name that for us Italians was the principle of a great victory. And then among the Slovenes, Trieste is ours, for example, and this, is controversial, as we learned when we visited this time last year. Okay, a third group of comments belongs to people who came to visit the museum because their relatives fought on the front, and that's an interesting analogy, comparison to make with the Historiale, I think. In particular, Italian visitors came to Coburg in a sort of pilgrimage from all over Italy, and this is seen in the messages again, in memory of my grandfathers Tonino and Francesco, who fought here learning to be men. Visitors visiting the museum also evoked emotional reactions in some visitors, expressing feelings of sadness, anger, compassion, hope. And this is interesting in terms of World War I being considered as cold memory. The Coburg Museum is obviously very able to stimulate passions, especially among the Italians. I love this comment, the museum gave me the creeps. So these strong passions were also confirmed by visitors in the interviews. The main difference between the two groups concerns the fact that Slovene visitors consider the museum educational, while in Italy the Caporetto defeat corresponds to an important historical event and is widely taught in schools. The First World War in Slovenia represents a minor event. The country belonged to the Austrian Empire at that time, while the war was eventually won by the Allies. Therefore, Slovene comments are very much focused on the educational side. Finally, some visitors expressed a sense of solidarity and support of the European message. So for example, there is no Italy, there is no Slovenia, Caporetto, Europe. And I'm going to finish there. There are some data comparing the comments, and here you can see that it's the anti-war message that comes out most strongly for both groups, Slovenes and Italians, visiting the museum. I'll pass on to Eleanor to conclude.
Okay, yeah, just a few closing words.
Very quick.
So it would be premature, of course, at this stage to present conclusions based on the data, which is still very much raw data. But one important finding arising from the visitor studies literature is that people are highly selective, both about the museums they choose to visit and the exhibitions and objects that they pay attention to. This has been confirmed, I think, or at least we're seeing some confirmation of this in our visitor studies research. For example, the battlefield tourism or the family links or even the general interest in history that motivates people to come to the museums. Researchers have noticed, not us, but more broadly, researchers have noted that visitors not only make choices on which museums to visit based on prior interest, enthusiasm and knowledge, but that these factors can also play a large part in directing their attention and the assimilation of new information that they encounter in museum settings. So this confirmation bias raises an important question for museums of all kinds about how to attract, interest and inform visitors with regard to novel and challenging topics and interpretations. But it's particularly pertinent for museums that seek to unsettle comfortable memories. Given the sophistication of today's audiences, are museums of difficult history in fact too easy on their visitors? As one of the visitors to the Historial said, are they too politically correct? Do they, or are they able to, invest enough in studying their visitors to find out? The challenge for us now is how to conduct an effective comparative analysis across our 5 case studies. Analysis of the data is in train, but we welcome any suggestions that you may have about making sure that we have consistent strategies for organising and interpreting the data across the teams and data sets. Thank you.